One of the things that you mentioned, Ashish ji, is how pride among various Hindu communities has been systematically eroded. And my next question to you actually relates to this. I think this is a subject that doesn't get talked about often, but you have written an article about this in Pragyata, and that is about the contributions of Shudras in our civilization. Now, in today's world, whenever you talk about Shudras, the very word itself tends to attract a lot of negative connotations, and people assume all sorts of things in their mind. But if we look at the history of our civilization, I believe Shudras have played such a critical role in not only helping the civilization survive but also thrive. Can you please share your thoughts on this?
Absolutely. I mean, Shudras have played a glorious role in as artists and artisans and all sorts of skills and manufacturing. I mean, the whole range of material activity, what you would call manufacturing in the current, current times. All that was under the, broadly under the umbrella of Shudras, right? And the Shudras have built the great temples that we were just talking about, right? They were the primary, the designers, the architects, the artisans, the sculptors, the carpenters, right? So so there is no denial. There is absolutely no sense in denying them the glory of what their ancestors were, involved with. So the thing is that they were always a proud people, that is the Shudras, uh, and they had all the reasons to be proud. Uh, they had their own system of education, and these days people say, oh, they were denied Vedic education. They were not denied Vedic education. They had nothing to do with Vedic education. We are talking about a pre-industrial era, right? So Vedic education is a very specialized form of education. Um, it takes almost a decade for someone to be well versed with the Veda, कि कंठस्थ भी हो जाए, बोलना भी, उच्चारण भी important है, and to have the knowledge of the Vyakaran, the Vedangas, the to have access to, I mean, to have read all the commentaries by the great acharyas. So all that is Vedic education, and it takes a long time, right? It takes almost a decade or more than that for higher caliber acharyas. Similarly, in parallel, the Shudras had their own education, right? So the for example, the 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 people who designed and built the Brihadishwara temple, for example, it's an architectural marvel. Uh, do, do you think any reasonable, any sane person would believe that this is the work of some unpada, illiterate person?
Right.
So they had their own rigorous system of education through which they were trained in various arts and craftsmanship, and things like architecture. They knew mathematics. They even knew Sanskrit, right? So the article that you mentioned, we've also provided inscriptional evidence from one of the great works by Vijay Ramaswamy, uh, where they've written in Sanskrit, right? So all that points to the glory of the Shudras only. And given that situation where you are going through a rigorous 10-year education in parallel with the Brahmanas, how will you suddenly switch course and start all over again and become a Vedacharya? So I mean, in that era there was no mobility, occupational mobility. You didn't, your father didn't tell you, beta तुम्हें क्या बनना है, doctor बनना है, engineer बनना है. You did what your father did, and that was as true for the Brahmins, the Kshatriyas, the Vaishyas, as the Shudras, right? So given that lack of choice, you had your own education system. So this whole business of being denied, and it's all ignorance, and more than ignorance, it's systematic propaganda. Why systematic propaganda? Because again, it goes back to the fact that we are a post-colonial society, and there was a period of colonization, and in colonization I don't just mean the British rule, but also the Middle Eastern colonization that happened, where a lot of turmoil took place, and the traditional institutions were, were broken. The continuity of the traditions were broken. There was pressure to convert, like in Kashmir, right? Uh, so all that happened. So many people died. There was a centuries of genocide which happened. So in those circumstances, there was a lot of misery, right? And often these communities, which were living in relative harmony, they turned hostile to each other, right? It could be anyone. It need not necessarily be upper versus lower. It could be lower caste versus lower caste, so called. I don't believe in this hierarchy, but I'm just using the common parlance. So this Shudra versus Shudra community also happened, right? And I could go on and on. For example, when we wrote the Shudra article, there were people who said that no, you have talked about Shudras because they are Savarnas. What about Avarnas? There is much to be said about Avarnas as well, and perhaps we'll soon write about them also. For example, how the Charamkars, the Chamars, how they fell on bad days, right? From the barter system of the Balutadari, where they were, they were taken care of, their families, everything was taken care of. They were even granted lands by the villages that they served. So they were landowners also, contrary to propaganda. To the times when the Britishers introduced industrial production of leather, right? What happened to that entire system where the chamar used to take the dead cow and process it, and in a very organic, using organic material and natural chemicals to process the leather. And then when they introduced chromium tanning, and all sorts of things happened, and then they encouraged cow slaughter, so the whole system got disrupted. And when this miserable time, when we now look back at it, we refer to the colonial sources, and these colonial sources are obviously justifying what they are doing, right? And then we cite those same sources and say that, look, these guys were at each other's throats all the time. That's not true. Any serious reading of it would tell you, any sincere and serious reading of the texts of the records of that era will tell you that this was not the case. That it was not that people were at each other, but they were made to fight each other, not in the sense of a conspiracy theory, but the situation became such that there was fight for small resources, right? Uh, and I'll try to make this brief because there's so much to say. But let's take the case of the chamars again. Normally, the cow dies, the chamar takes the cow, and then their community is further subdivided. They have their own divisions, in which the first person skins the animal, then the other person does the tanning, and the third person makes the footwear or the other stuff from leather, and then there is another community which repairs these things, right? So there is a complex ecosystem which is involved. Suddenly, the British come, and they implement these high taxes, all kinds of stuff. They bring in industrial production of leather, and they encourage cow slaughter. By encouraging cow slaughter, they incentivize the owners of the cows to sell their cows, right? When you sell the cow to the industry, what does the chamar get? Nothing. So who is responsible, right? it's the changed circumstances which were induced by the colonial power that were responsible for this disruption, that left the chamar at the brink of, not on the brink of, but completely powerless and in absolute poverty. So who's responsible? It was the British. But if you say that, they'll say, oh, you blame everything on the British. So that kind of stuff which goes on in the popular discourse, that has to be countered, and that has to be countered with good scholarship, not just sloganeering. Because what is at stake is really a choice between for the Shudras the choice between victimhood and self-esteem. And we all know where those two choices lead. If you are choosing victimhood, then you will perpetually remain a victim, and you will perpetuate that victimhood to your next generation, and on and on and on. And that will lead to nothing but disaster for your own community. So that's something that has gone on. And like I mentioned, that the democratic system also is responsible. The modern democracy is also responsible for destroying these communities in its own way, and atomizing society, and making them prone to manipulation, manipulation of identity, manipulation of history, and ultimately leading to totalitarian control. So corporations have their own role to play in that. The, the corporations, I mean, today also, the kind of conditions in which many of the industries, these, for example, the leather industry, if you look at the average condition of the worker in the leather industry, it is worse than slavery. But no one has the guts or the gumption to point that out, because, oh, it's modern industry. And you have the audacity to question a system where everything was in harmony. I'm not saying it was a utopia. There were conflicts, there were all kinds of things, but it was nowhere as bad as how it is today for them. But you're refusing to see the the complete mess in front of you because it's so horrible, and you're blaming some event in the past for which actually the people who enslaved you are responsible, but somehow you're internalizing that guilt. That's what is happening, and that is what colonialism and coloniality is all about. So, that it's a circular problem. So now that, I mean, if you bring in corporations to this mix, right, the modern corporations, you will realize that people from these marginalized communities are still being exploited, right? They don't live in great conditions, right? Which is why you have this whole Marxist and communist movement, and the labor unions and stuff. And there is a lot of propaganda happening from both sides. From the side of the capitalists who say that no, this is trickle down, we will make money, money will go to everyone. And there are communists who will say no, we need revolution and we need to break down everything. But they're basically working in the same framework, right? And they're fighting each other. It's just a dialectic that they are engaged in. Whereas the traditional system of organization, which was community based, had a lot more wisdom. It was not perfect, but it took care of its people. If you go to a leather processing shop today in Kanpur or Bangladesh, you will find people working in abysmal conditions, in toxic conditions, right? And no one questions that, because it's a modern industry. But today, where we are, when we are questioning the choices made by unknown people from 200 years back, without even bothering to understand the circumstances that led to those choices, uh, the people, I mean, we are answerable to posterity, and the coming generations will question us. That no one seems to realize in the popular discourse. So I think, I mean, the choice is clear, and we have to, the choice between victimhood and self-esteem is clear, and depending on what they choose, that will determine the future of a large section of India's population and the course of the country itself.
Absolutely, Ashishji. I think the discourse has to be corrected. It has to be seen in the, I mean, it has to be read properly. I think, like you said, there's a lot of need for scholarship also that focuses on these topics because so much has been distorted, especially because of the British sort of interventions in the whole systems.
No,
And like you
also the
said, the
scholarship, I mean, the need for scholarship is there, has been there, was always
right,
there.
right,
The problem is that the scholarship has been hijacked by an ideological group, which
right,
is the Marxists, and they will not allow dissent, right? And so you have tomes and tomes of false scholarship, being churned out, which repeats the same lie. And that repeating the same lie is classic propaganda.
Please remember to subscribe to us and switch on the notifications for this channel. For our other social media links, more content, and to support our work, please visit citti.net. Dhanyavad. Namaskar.